Okay friends, it's time to get started on our job. One of the first things you want to do is safely raise and support the front of your vehicle so the wheels are off the ground and the suspension is hanging. After that, remove all 5 of your 19mm lug nuts and then the wheel. Now with the wheels off of there, let's move along to our 36mm axle nut. Go ahead and remove that. Make sure the axle breaks free from the wheel bearing. If it doesn't, you can use a hammer and a punch right in the center. The next thing that we're going to pay attention to is our ABS wire. That's this wire right here. What we want to do is follow that wire all the way up to the point that it connects onto the body. You can see this bracket. Let's go ahead and use a 10mm to remove that, and then we can start disconnecting the ABS wiring harness. Now for this harness, right where my index finger is, you can see that there's a rectangular tab. When I squeeze on this, it's going to lift up on the other end, and I should be able to separate this. Every time you disconnect an electrical connector, take a peek. If you see any funny colors, it's corrosion and it would need to be dealt with. This one looks fine, so I can go ahead and set that aside. Now we can continue on to this area right here. You're going to find one more 10mm headed bolt. Go ahead and remove that, and that's going to take off the bracket for the ABS wire. The next thing we're going to do is move along to the caliper here. Now looking at it, you can see 2 caliper slider bolts, but we're not going to go ahead and touch either of these smaller bolts. The 2 bolts that we do want to touch are the caliper bracket bolts. They're a little bit larger, and they hold the caliper bracket to the knuckle. To remove these, I'm going to use a 17mm socket. Of course, we're going to inspect the bolts as we start removing them. I'm just going to put this back in a couple threads and fully remove the second. Now we can go ahead and remove the caliper from the rotor. Once you have it off of there, typically I like to give the pads a quick inspection. If it looks like they're worn or damaged in any way, it's a good time to go ahead and replace them. As you can tell, ours are brand new, so I'm just going to go ahead and hang this aside, putting no pressure on my flex hose. Now let's go ahead and take one of our lug nuts that we had removed. We'll just put that right onto one of the lug studs. Now looking at the rotor, you're going to find 2 mounting screws. We're going to use a Phillips head to remove the pair. I have an impact driver. Remove your rotor, set it aside. Now let's move down to the lower ball joint nut. Now for this, it has a strange cotter pin. I'll show you it in 1 second. I'm just going to get under this tab. We'll pull that away. You can set that aside. Use your 17mm to remove that nut. So now that we have the nut off of there, we're just going to put this back on a couple threads. Go ahead and follow that knuckle all the way up to where it connects onto the strut. Now we need to remove these 2 bolts. Now the pair of these bolts come through from the rear towards the front. The bolt head is a 19mm and the nuts themselves are 22mm. Now we can start removing these mounting bolts. Just keep in mind, once you take the pair of these out, this knuckle could potentially come towards you or away from the vehicle. When that happens, it might potentially hit up against you, or even you might put a tug on the axle. So once this does start coming down, you need to also make sure you're pushing the axle through the wheel bearing so you don't put a tug on either of your boots. Let's go ahead and pull this out. Now I'm just going to take the axle and I'm going to put it off to the side. The next thing that we want to do is use our pickle fork. I'm going to come right in between this area, being very careful not to damage the ball joint or the boot while I continue. Make sure you have the nut on here. Carefully remove the knuckle from the area. Let's move along the control arm to where the sway bar link connects onto it. Looking in the center of this, you can see that it has an Allen head hole inside of it. We'll just use an Allen head socket to hold the stud still, then you should be able to remove the nut. Commonly, if you're using an air gun, you don't even need to use anything in the center here. Now let's continue on by sliding this out of the lower control arm. Sometimes you can just go ahead and push on it. Other times you might have to try to pry it out of there. All right, at this point we're cruising. We have 2 more bolts to remove. We have a 19mm headed bolt that comes right up here through this hockey puck bushing, and it bolts into this area on the subframe. Also, if you were to follow the subframe back a little bit, you're going to find a second 19mm headed bolt. This one comes through from the front towards the rear, where it's going to thread in along the back. Let's start by removing the front. You always want to inspect your hardware as you remove it. Make sure you hold on to that control arm. We're going to give this bolt a wiggle, pull it on out of there. Quick inspection, set it aside. Now we can grab onto the control arm. We're going to give it a little wiggle up and down and try to pull it out. The reason why we want to wiggle it up and down is typically because the hockey puck bushing likes to stick inside this area of the subframe. There it is, friends. Before we continue with our installation, let's make sure we clean all the mounting hardware. Once you have the threading cleaned, go ahead and apply some red thread locker, and then we can continue on by grabbing our lower control arm. Let's get ready to install this in the vehicle. Now for this, of course, you're going to want to come in and underneath that sway bar. We'll get that close to position. Now we can start lining up our hockey puck bushing up along here. What you might notice is that it's going to hit up against the sway bar right here. You just want to be very careful for that. Generally, you can just kind of pivot it a little bit. It should want to slide up, and then you can go ahead and push this hockey puck bushing into position. Now we can take our 2 mounting bolts, go ahead and start them in. Now before you fully snug these bolts, just use a pry bar underneath the control arm up against the subframe. We're going to try to lift up on this control arm a little bit, essentially so it's in ride height position, as if the vehicle is on the ground. Once you have it in that position, go ahead and tighten them up. Once you have both bolts snugged, go ahead and torque each of them to 61 foot-pounds. Now let's use our pry bar. We're going to carefully get in between this area. We'll gently flex the sway bar until we can get the sway bar link into position in the control arm. Go ahead and slide that in. Now we can start the nut on there. Now let's torque this to 29 foot-pounds. Now we can get ready to install our knuckle back on here. I'm just going to take it, I'm going to slide the axle right through the bearing hole. Once I do that, I'll go ahead and line up that lower ball joint also. Now we can start sliding everything back into position. When you do this, be very careful for your ABS wire. You don't want it in between this area. Take your 2 mounting bolts with some red thread locker. We'll go ahead and start those through. Grab your 2 mounting nuts, start those on there. Now we can go ahead and bottom these out. Once we have them both bottomed out, we'll torque each of them to 116 foot-pounds. get the ball joint nut on here, bottom that out. Now let's torque this to 51 foot-pounds. Once you have it torqued, the next thing you want to pay attention to is the slots on the ball joint nut. You want to make sure it's lined up with the hole that's in the stud. If for some reason it is not, continue tightening this nut until the very next slot is. Once you have it lined up, let's go ahead and take our cotter pin. We're going to slide it through and peen it over so it locks in the nut and it can't loosen on us. The next thing we're going to do is get ready to put our rotor back on the hub. But before you do that, you just want to give it a quick inspection. Make sure it doesn't look like it's rusted and rotted, and it definitely doesn't have any buildup on it. Also, you want to pay attention to the back side of the rotor where it's going to meet up against that hub. Once again, you just want to make sure it doesn't have any dirt or debris in that area. After that, just apply a little bit of copper never sees, and then we can get the rotor on here. Now, before we start putting the rotor up on here, the couple areas that you want to pay attention to are, of course, the lug studs themselves, but also on the hub, you're going to find that you have two mounting holes. On the rotor, you'll find the same. Go ahead and make sure all the holes line up and put the rotor on. Once everything's lined up, go ahead and put on your screws. Now we can slide the caliper into position. We'll start in both of the mounting bolts, snug them up, and torque each of them to 80 foot-pounds. Now we can move along to resecuring our brake flex hose. Before we do, just double check to make sure it doesn't look like it's twisted in any way. If you're looking at it and it looks like it makes a little curly-Q, that means that you twisted the caliper, in which case you'd have to remove it, spin it around, and then just make sure it looks like it's in this position here. Assuming it looks good, let's go ahead and take this. We'll get it into position. We'll take our mounting bolts, start that in by hand. Once it's started in, you can go ahead and snug it up. Now it's time to start dealing with the ABS wire. Looking at the bracket, you can see that it has the hole, and then it has that little curved tab. Looking at the strut, you can see you have two holes. You want to make sure that you have the bolt hole lined up and the tab lined up. Let's go ahead and take this. We're going to bring it right underneath the flex hose here. You don't want to put it up and over the top. Now we can line up that bolt hole. We'll start the bolt in there and snug it up. Now we can move along to the rest of this. Let's reconnect in that ABS wire before we reconnect the bracket. Got a little click, give it a tug to make sure it's 100% secured. Now we're going to line up our bolt hole and our little tab with the bolt hole and the tab hole. Start in that mounting bolt. Let's apply some red thread locker to our axle stud. Let's get the nut on there. We'll bottom this out by hand, get the wheel closer to the ground, and then we can torque this. Now with this closer to the ground, I went ahead and I took a pry bar carefully across my studs just like this. That's going to prevent this from spinning on me while I continue torquing this axle nut. When I torque the axle nut, I'm going to torque it to 181 foot-pounds. The next thing you want to do is pay attention to the slot on the axle stud. We want to make sure that we go ahead and drive this nut end down into that to make sure it's locked in. Once you're sure it's peened down, we can continue. Let's get the wheel back on here. We'll start on all the lug nuts, bottom them out, get the wheel back on the ground, and then we'll torque each lug nut to 80 foot-pounds. Okay friends, we got the car back together. What's left to do now? Now typically you're going to want to make sure you take it for a road test, listen for funny noises, and safely make your way down to your local alignment shop. Thanks for watching.